about the money and the relationship of Black Lives Matter and the different Black Lives Matter institutions and the resources. And there are some things I think the writer didn't do correct. I think there's some things that the writer was a little off on in terms of their background. I'm not affiliated with Black Lives Matter, but I do, like all of us who do organizing work, may know people. In fact, I definitely know people who have been deeply involved in it, and some people who are mentioned in the story. But it breaks down to the murky way in which the finances were handled, the murky way in which it was almost like they were running a conglomerate, like with sub-corporations and stuff like that, several different names, different consulting groups, how the money was distributed. One of the most striking parts of it for me was reading about, like, they collected, for the reform LA jails, which was an initiative for reform. They created an organization and they collected more than $1.4 million in contributions. And they say more than half of that was paid out to just 4 recipients, right? One of which was a consultant who got $211,000. Another,
hold on. Please tell me the consultant was actually. Man, I was going to say, tell me it was a formerly incarcerated person that they designated a consultant and they gave them $200,000 to jumpstart their lives. No.
And I was Asha, who I've known for decades, worked with in New York, done organizing work. I think is sincere. But I also don't think that I don't think she deserves $211,000 as a consulting gig. So let me just be clear there. $205,000 went to Colors, a company that Patrice Colors operates with her spouse, Jana and Patrice Consulting. $86,000 was paid to Trap Pills LLC, an entertainment and clothing company who's owned by who? Damon Turner, the father of Patrice Colors' child. So it's that kind of, when you hear those kind of details, it is that kind of thing that gets your head spinning around. Again, you don't want to harp on these 3 particular women, but you got to point out that folks are basically duplicating the same thing that people of our age and younger would constantly talk about when Jesse Jackson did it and when Al Sharpton did it, right? When they did it, we talked about them stealing from the movement, capitalizing off the movement, making, their Pepsi with Jesse Jackson's Pepsi deals, Al Sharpton with directly making money off the families of people who were victims of police brutality and building a career off of it. We talked ad nauseum about how we thought that was not only a disgrace, but anti-revolutionary, right? That was reactionary stuff. And then for now, a new generation, again, whether they purposely did it, whether they sort of fell into it and they didn't understand everything that was happening around them, whether they got caught up in it, but they definitely are doing it. And then some of the same people that I know personally are now down with it, or now using the counter thing is that, and this reporter actually says this when you ask about it, it's immediately thought of, the pushback is that you're being sexist, right? Or you're being anti-LGBTQ just by asking the question. He has this weird comeback that he lays out. He says, he's a Black male and raised by a single Black mom, and he's had a gun pointed at him by police. I was like, well, you don't have to go all the way there. No one, you could just say you're a reporter and you have a right to ask the question, because if somebody's taking money and the claim is that they're doing work for Black people, then Black people should have an opportunity to ask and demand.
Yes.
Well, then what's happening with those resources? What is and again, they did not have a 501c3 themselves, but they had fiscal sponsors who, again, because they were fiscal sponsors, they were never directly reporting how much money was brought in under the name of the BLM type of organizations. And so only until last year, I think, was the first sort of public exposure that at least one of the BLM organizations, I think is BLM Global, took in that 1 year now, $90 million. Yeah. So that's the kind of thing, again, it hurts our movement. It hurts the credibility of the movement. I'm not saying that these people, again, did it purposefully, that maybe they fell into it, maybe they didn't understand, maybe they thought, and I think sometimes people feel like they have this master strategy that others don't get to talk about or direct or have influence over. But from the outside looking in, again, your master strategy seems very familiar to the strategy for decades, which has been to rely not only exclusively, but maybe just almost all of your time on electoral policy apparatus as your decision making or as your mode of operation for fixing the problems of Black people. And lastly, I say, it's $90 million later, hundreds of $1,000,000 later, right? We don't have a center to look at, community centers to look at. We don't have modes of organizational apparatus to look at. We don't have examples or models of community development to look at. We don't have anything of that to look at after these several, like now 5, 6, 7 years since Trayvon Martin has passed, and then when Mike Brown passed. That's sort of like the two ways in which really the movement started to get flooded. Certain parts of the movement started to get flooded with money. We don't have anything really, even policy changes.
That's
we don't
right.
have anything, the central thing that they all said they were doing to look at to show what was the outcome of this, right? So we need to do an autopsy of Black Lives Matter. We need to go deep into it. We need to understand what happened, how to pull people, how, again, not to demonize people, but how to look at political. Some of these people actually claim they had, and some of these people I know have strong political ideology. So it's not strictly political education. It's about aspirations taking over from your political education. And at the same time, you have a system which is feeding you this money and feeding you these ideas of fame, of resources that you've never dreamed of or imagined. And that begins to take over slowly, but surely, from the day-to-day work that at least you claimed at one point you were committed to.
That's a lot to unpack there, Kamau. And I have lots of questions. Now, I have not read this article that you're referencing, so forgive me if I don't know some of the details. But there's a couple of things that you said I wanted to touch back on. So when you first mentioned, I think it was $1.4 million raised for LA jail fund or jail.
Yeah. Which is an organization, really quickly, was an organization, sort of a new organization created to do policy work in LA, but created by colors.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So this is also not only just Black Lives Matter organizations, but they create other organizations, which again would have a little bit of employees. But then, so when Patrisse Cullors rightfully says that she didn't take money from Black Lives Matter Global, right? But she got money from these other sources of income, including book deals and other things. Part of those sources in consulting, part of those sources of income is that you are now put in a position to create these organizations through the work, through sort of being on Front Street around creating the hashtag and then the organization, which allow these other income streams to come in the first place. It wasn't like somebody just gave you these income streams. They gave them to you based on who you were supposed to have been or represented movement-wise post the killing again of Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown. And so again, part of it was that these other organizations were created, which allowed folks to raise money, and then they used that money, and they did some of the work with that money, but they also used a lot of that money to dole out large sums, 6 figures we're talking about.
And that's what I was going to ask you, because you mentioned the one sister, and again, this is not singling her out at all, but just because you referenced her, but you said that she got a $200,000 consulting fee. And that kind of, I want to ask you this, Kamau. I mean, we believe that, well, let me not say for we, I believe that 90 million was probably not managed and not redistributed in ways that I think a lot of us would have hoped that $90 billion would be redistributed and set up apparatuses, et cetera. But it raises another question about activist work. And activists will sometimes say that, hey, we're working for the people here, but that don't mean that we have to starve. And I wanted to get your take on that, because activism work and organizing work is generally low paid, if unpaid, right? Yeah. It's hard. It's hard work. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. But when it comes to compensation. I'd be curious as to your thoughts about that, because and also how organizations respond when they are flooded with cash that perhaps they were not expecting. I remember reading, this was last year, no, maybe it was even 2020. There was I can't remember if it's the Minneapolis Bail Fund. I'm getting the name wrong, but it was a group based out of Minneapolis that was doing bail work, right? And they all of a sudden got all this money and they were overwhelmed by it because they had been a small organization. They were not a six-figure operational type of group. So what's it like? And again, I'm not trying to get too much off track here, but I want to get your thoughts about that. Like, what's it like for organizations to deal with a lot of money that perhaps they were not expecting? And what do you think that activists should be paid?
Yeah, I think it's a totally legitimate question. And in fact, the problem is that we don't have the discussions. We don't talk about these things, right? So, and I'm going to use myself as an example. So, like, you know, like I got politicized because of circumstances and reading. And then I wanted to do stuff in my community, right? Most of my life, I've never gotten paid for organizing work. Most of my life, organizing work was coming out your pocket. You know, in fact, you're coming out your own pocket for resources. You're raising money amongst friends, family, or whatever. You're not getting, you know, when I started, these grants, particularly for organizations that consider themselves radical, were just not available, right? In fact, they looked at, you know, I belong to organizations with an organization called Malcolm X Grassroots Movement. They looked at our name and it's like, already, dude, you're not getting no money from us, right? You're not getting no dough with that name, right? So, you know, most of that is like that was the love of the work, the love that you believed in radical revolutionary change. You believed in it and you did it. And again, the nonprofit industrial complex was already there, but some of us didn't experience it right away in terms of jumping into organizing. But there did become a time period where our organization and other organizations could get a little bit more money because folks who came before us got into some positions of power where there were more discussions about resource distribution. There were more discussions about making sure you get money to people and all that kind of stuff, right? So there did become times where people would get money and then people, you know, again, are doing hard work. And so I do believe that there is space to compensate people if you want to get this work done in a way that you can actually impact large systems. People romanticize revolutionary struggle. Most of the revolutionary movements that we know of that we romanticize or talk about, they got funding. They didn't get funding from nonprofit. They got funding from other states. They got funding because they actually taxed landlords. They got funding because sometimes they actually taxed the people, right? And said, instead of your money going here, it's going to go here. So there's always ways in which revolutionary movements have been funded, right? So we shouldn't just act like people are doing this, have done this strictly because of their revolutionary fervor, and that there was never some compensation, particularly if, again, you don't build armies where you need food, weapons, uniforms, tents, other things. You don't do that because you put your money in the pot, in the hat, in the middle, and that's how you get it, right? People do expropriations. They rob banks. They do things, right? Legal and illegal, in order to further their revolutionary struggle and movement. But anyway, so in the United States, of course, because the capitalist system is so strong, most of that stuff will lead to what happened to our folks in the 60s and 70s, which is that it led to prison, right? So when people tried to fund movements outside of the system through expropriations, it led to prison, right? And so again, you know, no fault of our own, most of us are not ready to handle that. So how do we get money, right? We do the fundraisers, we got dues, we got the rest of it. But also now there's these entities that are saying, we're going to give you $25,000. We'll give you $30,000 to do that work. We'll give you $50,000 to do that work, right? And you try to align the money that you're getting with the work that you are doing. But we all know that this system is built, as again, as we've spoken about, is, you know, particularly during the civil rights movement. What was destroyed? The radical militant left movements. What was left in place were the nonviolent integrationist policy electoral movements, right? And if we look back at 1963, the civil rights, the famous March on Washington, one of the things that came out of it was the understanding that SNCC was forced to change its speech in order to appease Kennedy. And in exchange for appeasing, I think it was the Ford Foundation, might have been Rockefeller, but all the big six organizations were hit off, if I'm correct, either $50,000 or $100,000 each, right? So that, the grand bargain was in place. But slowly but surely, these organizations current day are getting resources. And so, yes, I think people should get paid reasonable amounts of money, salaries individually. This year, for the first time, I got, for my work with community movement builders, I'm now making a salary of $60,000. Prior to this year, I made $30,000, $40,000, $20,000 off of that. And I did other things on the side, and my wife has a job. We hired 2 people recently. We pay them more than I make, even as the executive director, because they left jobs, but under $100,000, $85,000. They left jobs to work for the organization which they were making more money in, right? Those things should be things we discuss in public and have discussions. But you can't tell me that you need to pay a consultant $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 a pop, right?
That sounds like some DNC shit. You know what I mean?
It just sounds like I know some other folks who and lastly, I'll say the opening up of movement resources, people have now used movement language in order to get resources, right? They've used movement language in order to get use, where you can say things like Black liberation, you can say Black self-determination, you can say I'm going to be more radical than not. And these days, the liberal nonprofit apparatus, and some of this is based on what happened during Black Lives Matter, has said, yes, we will open it up, even with that language, even with that kind of language. So it's not about the radical work, right? But you can use radical language and still get money these days. But still, you're forced into one of the things they force you into, they herd you into that electoral work and that policy work. You get herded like sheep. And whether you see it, whether you see it happening, whether you understand it's happening, whether or not you didn't think that that's what you were doing, that's part of what's happening in terms of movement politics. And the people who are doing it, and again, all these people, again, you know these people because you've worked with them over the years and I'm old. Van Jones set some precedents in a modern age for basically selling out activism, right? And then he's used that to walk other organizers through the door when they got their chance at big money to tell them, then this is how you do it. Here, let me introduce you to these Democrats who are your friends and allies, because this is how you do it. Let me introduce you to the rich white man and or white woman who's going to give you some money, and this is how you talk to them, and this is how you do it, and this is how you do it. Let me get you on these TV stations so that you can get your message out, and to get you on some of these newspaper articles written about you, get you on some magazine covers, because this is how you do it. This is how you do it, right? And that's the thing that continually leads people to think, oh, these other people behind us, who we used to know, the haters. They don't understand what we doing. We making big moves with big people, right? They don't get it, right? Only we get it now, because now we're in a position to get this money. And again, I think it's insidious. I think some people know better. I think some people get caught up. I think some people just think they're accurate and they're correct on their politics or what they're doing. But from my vantage point, and I think from the vantage point of a lot of people who are on the ground trying to do work, it doesn't seem like whatever you think you're trying to accomplish, you have not accomplished. And so therefore, we need to all sit down and evaluate and have an autopsy and figure out, when resources come, what happens to them? How do you know? If you're, again, I'll shut up after this. If you're claiming you're doing things for Black folks and it's through organization, then you need to be public as possible with what you're doing and how you're doing it. And if you claim that you're not, then shut the fuck up and don't use the language of Black liberation. Don't use the language of Black self-determination. Don't use the language of like radical discourse or fighting capitalism, because then that's not what you're doing. You may be doing reform work and just admit that you're doing reform work, but don't use the language that's really about a struggle for our people to break away from a system of oppression and not to be a part of it.
What could community movement builders do with $90 million, Kamau?
Yeah, we never had it. Well, I mean, but if we did have it, we would buy apartments, houses, storefronts. We would build a model where a lot of our folks could live. There's models of organizing, which even come from our history. When you look at the history of SNCC, there's models of organizing of SNCC moving down to Mississippi, doing Freedom Summer, and some people staying right in Mississippi and living amongst the people and organizing with them people and doing the freedom schools, which they actually taught lessons on communism, which they talked about organizing the masses of people, both in electoral strategy and an outside strategy, right? So though there are lessons around the world, which I won't mention here because I'm trying to make sure we stay on YouTube, of folks who are doing organizing work, which is ingrained with the very people that they're supposed to be working with. There's ways that it's a slower build, it's a base building build. You ain't gonna get you a magazine covers build, but there is a way in which the work should be done. If you're really talking about liberation and you're going to change people's minds and hearts, you're going to make them believe that we can accomplish things. There's models that could have been built with those kinds of resources, but instead, too many of those resources again went into hands, and we are hearing about some of the consultants that we know that are from our movement, but the Democratic consultants, the people who are the lobbyists, all those folks, I'm sure, raked in the dough, right? And again, some of those folks will take money from anybody, but raked in the dough off of that 90 million, right? And again, it only took the other organizations and or chapters, whether official or not, of Black Lives Matter, to really call out some of this stuff to get them in their individual chapters. I think this story, another story I read, describes how some of those chapters got $500,000 each, finally, to try to do the work that they were doing on the ground. But think of what could have been. Again, I'm not a huge fan of some of the politics of Black Lives Matter, but there was a moment in which they captured a lot of attention and people on the ground. And people all over the country were popping up saying they want to be Black Lives Matter chapters. Just imagine the movement that could have been built if building chapters was embraced, and if building a leadership structure which made sure those chapters had some say in how things were to be conducted, even in terms of money, strategy, as opposed to a small clique of people who, again, that small clique telling everybody else we're a leaderless organization, right? We don't want to tell the people what to do, but when it came to the money, they people got to be real big leaders on that, right? So just imagine what could have happened, again, notwithstanding my political differences with those folks, but what could have happened if those folks had decided to actually structure an organizational apparatus that had some sort of coordinating committee structure in which people could respond to, people on the ground could see there could be common strategies and goals. Again, there's no reason why that could not have happened, except, like you pointed out, except that money came in. Other people got to those folks first and told them these were the strategies. These were the strategies for you to employ.
So okay, I don't doubt that other people probably got in their ear and led them further astray, but something has already kind of got to be in you if you intentionally use Black suffering as a stepping stone to your career aspirations or to your economic aspirations. And I'm not even saying that was intentional or deliberate, but when the opportunity presented itself, right? When Ferguson presented itself, when the murder of Mike Brown and Trayvon Martin and all these tragedies that befell our community, when opportunity presented itself, people stepped right on up. And when you hear about people connected to these organizations using some of that money to buy, $1 million homes and $100,000 luxury cars, and it's like, why are you here? I don't even understand, why are you here? Why are you here? And not to say that you don't deserve, nobody deserves $100,000 car. Let me put it that way. Fuck this capitalist shit that if you work hard, you get to play hard too. Nah, nigga. You for the people, ain't nothing wrong with that Toyota. That Toyota will suit you just fine. You do not need that Tesla. But it just kills me, how easily people can be revealed. Their true intentions or their true characters can be revealed as soon as that check clears, baby. That's why I respect Jared. Jared already tells us he's selling out for 4% cost of living increase. He don't give a fuck. I respect that about him for disclosing that to us. So
I think people have, and obviously some of this is about people's politics, but I think again, in America, aspirations sometimes trumps politics. And so when
Jeez,
aspirations become, I think when people point it out to you, and again, when it's framed in a way in which you think what you are doing is adding to the work, then in your mind, you're like, oh, and I can cash out too. So I think it's, I'm not suggesting that people didn't know what they were doing completely, but I also, if I give some folks some benefit of the doubt, I think the wheel is greased to get you into that, and again, it's like, whether we talk about music or other art forms or other things, it's like when people open some doors and tell you this is how you do it, and this is the resources that you can get to do ABC. Sometimes we think we're playing chess when we're really playing checkers and others are playing chess on us, right? We think we're doing ABC and we're going to get all these things done. But in reality, other folks have already, they have a machinery in place, right? Mm-hmm. You're not going to go inside the Democratic Party and change the Democratic Party. It's going to change you, right? Mm-hmm. Anybody should be smart enough to know. The moment you do something serious to make the Democratic Party more radical, it's moment that the Democratic Party shuts down it's the moment that those rich people take their money and start a third party themselves. That's when they start a third party, right? Yes. If you've successfully changed the Democratic Party to represent the masses of people, if you've somehow overcome that huge hurdle and you've done that, know that the result of that is that the rich people who fund the Democratic Party are going to get another party. So, there's no the game that you think you're playing with them. They're just trying to ease these tensions on the street. If you want some things done, as Obama said, you got to get some policy work in here. Let's get a bill going. Let's get that flowing. All that street shit, go home. That's what they tell them. And they tell them this is the correct way to do it. And in exchange for that, here's a famous actor and actress you get to meet.
Hey, Hill Hopper.
We'll go to the Oscars this year. We'll go to the Oscars this year. We'll go to the Grammys.
Williams. Oh, we're going to the Oscars because Oscars
make
so
a speech. You want to stand up on the stage and make a speech?
Motherfucking Oscars still so white.